you with us at the Center for Public Leadership. And what I'd like to do is walk through a series of questions that we ask as part of our Lessons of Leadership archive project. The first set of questions have to do quite a bit about your experience as an individual. So to start, I'd be curious to know what happened or did not happen in your early life that might help explain your call to action and your call to leadership.
We're getting very Freudian here. I guess you just look back and say, okay, maybe these things had something to do with how you turned out. I've had enough therapy over the years, God knows, mostly Freudian, although not all. A lot of things you don't know where they come from, and I don't know what made me angry. I don't know what made me be able to fight back. Plenty of people have unhappy childhoods, and plenty of people have parents that they're not fond of, both of which are true in my case. But often, in those cases, the children or the offspring are damaged in sort of different and potent ways. I don't know what made me stand up to my father, who was very abusive to me, but I did. And I had a mother who defended me, but whose defense I didn't believe. So I felt very much a loner and alone. I suspect that my brother, who shared similar feelings toward my parents, our parents, was my major role model, and certainly he has been exceedingly my parent in life. He's the one that sort of almost brought me up and saw that I got the good education and did the right things, got me into therapy. So I don't know if this contributes to the ability to respond to what I perceived as a danger when I did, but to this day I don't know really where all of that comes from. I had a mother who was a social worker. She ran the local chapter of the American Red Cross in a small Maryland town near where we lived. And so whether her notion of service and taking care of people and all that rubbed off on me, I don't know. I'd rather tend to think not, because we used to make fun of it. So, she was out there taking care of everybody but us. But so be it.
And if those were some of the early life experiences, what about things more proximal to when you first started to get engaged, when you first started to get active? What were some of the immediate things going on then that may have led you to?
I mean, I had a bunch of friends who got sick, and I had a bunch of friends who died, and I knew them all, and a doctor whom Alvin Friedman Keene of NYU, who made the first announcement in the New York Times of what was going on, a man whom I respected, said, I think it's read by Saxon. I think that something's going on here, and if it were happening, he said, I think people should realize that something is going on and modify their behavior accordingly. And I said that because it made a lot of sense to me. As I said it earlier today, I don't think that it took any great perception. I'm always being given credit of being some kind of seer. I don't understand why other people didn't see it too. As I said, anybody who spent a night, all night long in the meat rack at Fire Island Pines should have enough brains to realize that something like this is certainly possibly happening. And God knows I've spent enough nights myself in the meat rack of Fire Island Pines. So Looking back on it, I don't know. I was made angry by the fact that nobody was willing to pay any attention to it, and instead of turning my back, it just made me angry, and I'm glad that it did. We needed help, and no one was there to give it to me or to us. And I had gone to Yale, and I had been very successful in the world, and I was not used to being shunned. I had been assistant to the president of Columbia and then United Artists. I had supervised hundreds of employees. I had huge budgets that I oversaw. I was used to people listening to me. And when we were trying to get our first office space from the city for a little minuscule operation, because no one would rent to us, even though we had the money, so we wanted something from the city, try to get a hold of the mayor, and I was pretty much told I was made to feel demeaned, and I didn't like the feeling, and that made me angry. At the same time, there was a letter to the editor published in the New York Native, our newspaper in New York, a newspaper, written by a playwright, now dead from AIDS, by the name of Robert Chesley, which made me very angry as well, because he was responding to my earlier plea, not the 1,112 and counting article, but I had written something earlier than that. And he just made fun of me and said that there goes Larry Kramer again. He had hated Faggots, my novel, and in which he maintains Faggots is about that the wages of gay sex is death, which it certainly isn't, nor is it the theme of the novel. And what made me mad about Chesley's attack was that we had been together, we had been to bed together, and he had come to interview me for a publication, and he professed to thinking that Faggots was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And we went to bed together, which the minute I did it, I knew was a mistake. And he wanted to do it again, carry on with from there, and I didn't. And so he turned on me and wrote very nasty pieces about me in the gay press, and then attacked me over my call to arms. And I just thought that made me very angry, because that's not what it was about. You know, he was attacking me on a personal vendetta level, and the hypocrisy of that made me angry. And I was going to a very good shrink at the time, Norman Levy, his name was, and he saw how angry I was, and he says, well, why don't you do something about it? And it went from there. I don't know how. He said, why don't you just, I don't know, what are you? You're a writer, write about it. So then I sat down and wrote 1,112 and counting.
I'd be interested to have you speak a little bit about what you think someone can achieve through their writing in terms of influencing others and mobilizing them for change versus what he or she can do through their actions. Because one of the interesting things...
I don't know how to answer those questions. They're too global, or they're too... You have to have certain skills, and you have to have, the timing has to be right, and GMHC came along and people responded to it because the time was right, and ACT UP came along and at a moment in time when there was all that energy ready to be coalesced, and a lot of it is timing. I don't think you could start an ACT UP today or a gay organization today that would get those kinds of responses as we got in those days. In terms of, can writing change the world? Well, obviously I think so, because that's why I'm a writer. I am fortunate that I have certain skills, or I've discovered that I had certain skills to be able to write. Whether people will listen or not, I don't know. I'm always amazed when anybody knows who I am, and that's true. I just...
I'd like to push on this a little bit, because it's one of the discussions within leadership is, do great moments make great leaders, or do great leaders create great moments? And I guess if you were thinking about things in the environment that would let something like an ACT UP or a GMHC take hold and take off, what sorts of things do you think that sort of are going on in the environment that makes it ripe for those kinds of things?
My mind doesn't work that way. Do great leaders make great causes or whatever? I don't know. What makes a movie star? What is it about a person's persona that makes somebody captured on film memorable, and someone just walk across the screen and you've forgotten her or him? I don't think anybody can define those things. I certainly don't think I've got charisma or whatever. I think now people respect me, but they didn't throughout all of those years. I had a small group of people who were loyal and faithful, and we managed to accomplish certain things, and it's gone on from there.
What skills or traits do you think that you brought to bear that small group may have responded to, or?
I've always said exactly what I felt. I don't care if it makes people angry, if that's how I feel. I've always been very honest and truthful, and I've not been afraid to confront people of power. And I've never been afraid of anyone. And I think as we were a community that was in New York that was frightened, that impressed people. They needed that. Or some people needed it. There were plenty of gay people who hated me and who would cross the street not to be on the same side. And that's true. I was no longer welcomed at Fire Island after Faggots came out. I'm serious. I was actually asked to leave. And I'm sure there are people to this day who from those generations who disapprove of me. But that has never bothered me, and I don't know where that came from. I've been able to ride, and that, I think, just comes from a lot of therapy. To be able to say what you want to say seems to be worth any price. It wasn't always that way. I was a frightened child, and I certainly was timid.
Interesting. Are there any personal limitations that you think may have hampered?
Limitations.
So if we talked a little, or think a little bit about the aptitudes that you had, things that you might say, gee, without this I would have been more effective, or...
Oh. Well, I went through a period where I thought that all the leaders of who were fighting AIDS, everybody had a tragic flaw of one sort or another. The people who were the smartest, Mathilde Krum, Joe Sonnabend, myself, really had a sense of what it was all about, had certain character traits that rendered us impossible of being as effective as we could be. Perhaps my temper, my hot-headedness, certainly Joe's inability to communicate with other people, and Mathilde's sort of, I don't know what her tragic flaw is, but because she's a great lady, but why couldn't she take it further, whatever? She wasn't good at choosing people to run her organization. She had a bad sense of management choices, so that AmFAR never became quite the organization it should have been, because she put inept people in charge of it constantly. So, but after a while you realize you and AmFAR is still there, and Matilda's still fighting, so you realize that you work with what you got, and I didn't know how to do it any other way. I mean, you couldn't say, Larry, shut up, because if Larry shut up, then Larry would be rendered immobile. I was very happy to discover, and I didn't know this, that I could write political rhetoric. That was all news to me. I'd never tried before. I'd written Faggots, and I'd written a couple of plays that were very unsuccessful. And I had written the screenplay for Women in Love, so I knew that I could write, but these were all different kinds. This was more imaginative writing. Now I was writing nuts and bolts, angry rhetoric. I didn't know. I was just trying to make people sit up and pay attention, and I used strong language, and I turned out I could do it well. That was a nice surprise.
I'm curious, do you have role models, either contemporary or historical? And if so, who would you identify and why? What is it about them that you either emulate or appreciate?
Oh, I don't know. When I was a kid, Helen Keller used to make me cry.
Cry why?
Because I tend to respond to people who can overcome physical disabilities in such a fashion as she did. It still gives me the chills when I see people like that. Are there writers that I admired? It's hard to say because I knew I was gay and I knew that there were very few people writing about gay stuff, straight or gay. And so it was hard to say. I admire Evelyn Waugh, whom I do enormously, the British writer, even though he was a gay man who was no doubt homophobic. So did I admire him? He was just one of the greatest stylists in the world, and I learned from him. Was he a role model? No, he was not a nice person. I admired I admired a lot of the South American writers who, like Marquez, who wrote political stuff, and there wasn't an American role model that I had. Writing about political stuff and being a creative novelist in America just doesn't go together. And I got a lot of flack from the, quote, gay literary mafia, unquote, guys, who because I wasn't saying what they wanted to hear, that gay is wonderful and blah, blah, blah. So
for you, an inspiring role model would, clearly the tenacity of a Helen Keller, but in addition, it sounds like you were hungry for someone who combined the literary endeavor with the activism angle?
I don't think I was hungry for it. No, it's the wrong word. If they were there, fine. I didn't see the person there.
But straight writers or straight advocates, was there, in terms of someone from the world of advocacy who you emulated, or was it really a kind of see as it goes?
I didn't emulate anyone. I made it up as I went along. I've said that quite often. We made it up as we went along in both GMHC and in ACT UP. What was needed that day? What was the emergency that day? Who were we after that day? And it changed day by day. We made it up as we went along. One day the enemy was this person, and the next day it was that person, and you had to be able to be adept enough to swivel and punt and all of these things.
We have a question here.
We did not have any role models, unfortunately.
One of the questions we typically ask, I think I'm going to modify. The question is, how did you stay alive in terms of maintaining your position in equilibrium in the face of opposition? And if I might be so bold, it may sound that you came more alive in the face of opposition.
Well, that's exactly why I stayed alive. I cannot tell you the excitement both of these organizations, GMHC and ACT UP, were in the earlier days. It was euphoric that one had a group of like-minded individuals who were all fighting for the same thing and all getting along with each other and all just so excited about the fight and about being with each other. It was like the biggest fraternity ever. I don't mean fraternity because there were certainly women around, but in the case of GMHC and ACT UP, those first 3 or 4 years in both organizations, it was just every day was exciting. Even though all these terrible things were happening, we were fighting, and we were fighting together, and that's what certainly kept me alive. It was euphoric. It was exciting. We had meetings, and by the time ACT UP came along, we had so many committees. We had meetings every single night of the week, and different people fighting for different aspects of the same problem, and they were all over town, people's apartments, various office buildings, and it was almost as if one didn't have enough time to sleep. It was so exciting. Yes, that's what kept me going, and it was filled with a lot of love. It was the best thing about being gay. It was the best feeling to be with all your brothers and sisters who were all working together. I've never seen lesbians and gay men work so well together as in especially the early days of ACT UP. If we had fights over things, we were able to work them out in the most amicable fashion. The women taught us a lot about women, about dealing with lesbians, which all of us had been completely ignorant about. And it was heady stuff.
It's during that time, was there time for relaxing or time for play, or was?
Well, we thought this was play. We had parties. God knows we had parties. I mean, you can't get a couple hundred gay men together without there being a lot of interactions of one sort or another. It got to the point where it was the thing to do, was to come to an ACT UP meeting, and suddenly it was all the hot young men were going to ACT UP, and believe me, there were plenty of cruising, plenty of gay, plenty of handsome men around, and I'm sure a lot of them were partnering in one way or another. And yes, there was a lot of partying, but we had a cause. It wasn't that we have to take time off. You know, we would vacation with each other sometimes or whatever, but people were dying like flies. That's the subtext of all of this, and I mean like flies. You know, when we started it, there were 41 cases was how many when it was in the original New York Times article, and 1,112 is counting, that's how many there were. That was a few months later, and it was escalating. Where there's a line in the normal heart, where we were living was wartime, where everyone else is living it's peacetime, and we're all in the same country, meaning the straight people and the gay people, and there wasn't a week goes by where somebody wasn't sick, where you weren't going to see someone in the hospital, where you weren't going to a memorial service, whatever. That's the subtext of all of it. So of course we clutched to each other and found joy and affection and support where we could, and we all got enormous sustenance from the anger. These demonstrations that were planned as, you know, street theater and all, they were made with passion and with love.
With passion, with love, and with anger? Definitely
with anger. Yeah. They're not mutually exclusive things, you know. We never forgot that there was an enemy out there, and that the enemy was them, and very identifiable. And there was a time I wrote where I didn't want to talk to a straight person in my own family. My best friends, Calvin Trill, and I once said to him and his wife, "Dear friends, you know, I can't have you as my friends because you're not helping me fight." And I certainly said that to my own family. So that's what it was like. We were at war, and nobody understood that. And yes, most people thought I was overreacting. I didn't think so. No one in ACT UP thought so.
Would you paint for us a picture of how you view human nature? So what do you think are some of the most striking things of that?
People don't behave very well in groups. I've said that. I don't think very much of human nature. I'm a very positive person who's got a lot of negative thoughts about the world. I think basically people are shits, greedy, selfish, and single-minded about the wrong things. Yes, we all have friends that we love very much, but there's precious little milk of human kindness around, or charitable, do unto others kind of thing. I think there's an awful lot of pretense and a lot of hypocrisy. That doesn't mean that I'm not happy or that I don't have a lot of friends whom I love, but I think basically if you take human nature as a group, who was it, Samuel Johnson or somebody who said, who was it? In essence saying, I like Peter and Paul, but I don't like the humankind. kind of thing. And that's basically how I feel. We are simply beastly with each other. This is a plague that was allowed to happen from day one. What I was saying then, 1,112 and counting, is now 60 million and counting. And all these, whatever years it is since 1981, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And we have said exactly the same thing every single year. We've pointed out exactly what was happening, and nobody in any effective authority or position of leadership has done anything about it.
Let's talk a little bit about that. So I could imagine when you talk about the them, it could be the individuals in leadership. But I could also imagine it would be kind of a sort of great unwash, an unmobilized middle, similar to your friends who you said, at this point you're not with me, so I have to, stick. So I'm curious how you think about that challenge of the few who are clearly the leadership of the opposition versus how we think about the great majority of folks who are neither with you nor against you.
What do I think of them? I think they're pigs. It's hard not to.
And did you see your role as engaging or speaking to them, or were you really focused on the leadership?
You can't make people do what they don't want to do. For a brief moment in my life, there were enough people who cared about the same issues that I did and were willing to come and fight. So we had an army. That army has disappeared. I have a great deal of impatience with many of my friends, many of whom are quite wealthy, who do not do anything, including write checks. And so be it. You can't make them write the check.
Right. So if the first set of questions thought or asked quite a bit about individual experiences, I'm going to switch now and ask you a couple of questions about thinking about the folks who you helped to mobilize, so people who were part of the... How do you see, if someone wishes to mobilize or engage other individuals on behalf of particular goals, are there ways to do that? Is that you think it's more of a natural kind of organic process? Are there... I mean, you can imagine someone having this vision or this anger in isolation versus pulling together others who are, to create this army of like-minded individuals.
There's an essay I wrote in Reports from the Holocaust about how to mobilize a group, I wrote it somewhere along the way, mid-'80s, about if you wanted to get together and start a group. I don't think that it's all that different now, if you care. In my estimation, to be a successful activist, if you will, is to identify an issue that you care passionately about, that really turns your juices on, and that can sustain your anger. You have to understand that I consider anger an incredibly positive emotion.
Unequivocally so, or?
Oh, you go too much for the
Yes.
extreme. Unequivocally so. No, is love? Do I approve of love unequivocally? I mean,
But you've yet to see anger, too much anger in a situation. Yeah.
well, let me put it this way: I'm surprised that there hasn't been more out and out violence. The people have put up with such shit, especially people of color, especially poor people. I'm amazed that there are not more riots of one sort or another. The downtrodden masses are certainly downtrodden.
And any thoughts? I asked earlier about human nature. Any thoughts on why that anger is so easy to, if not to ignite, if it's so hard to ignite, or why it's so easy to expunge, or why we don't see that anger more?
I think people are afraid. I think that they're afraid of police, and in most countries they have very good reason to fear them, including ours. People are essentially cowards. People are essentially don't have the courage of their convictions, and quite often don't know what their convictions really are. People just want to be left alone. They want to go home to whatever's there and be safe. You can have the most awful things happening in your family or in your life, but there's a safety in silence and being alone. It's unfortunate, perhaps, but it's understandable.
I'm curious, though, did you see your role at all as to shake people from that false sense of security?
I didn't see my role as anything. And people always said, "Oh, you had strategy and you made this, you planned all this out." We didn't. I've said it before. I said it again. We made it up day by day. I didn't see my role as anything except to be as useful as I could, wherever I could, in any way I could, to whatever it was that I thought needed attention to that day. I found that I was effective I was a good name caller, and I wasn't afraid to do it. And there wasn't anybody else out there who was willing to say that the mayor of New York City was gay, for instance, or that Ronald Reagan wasn't saying the word AIDS because he had a gay son. All of those things were said in public by me, which was considering, shocking tactics. So, what was the question?
You've answered it. I've had the benefit of hearing you speak earlier today, and I guess what I would ask is, one of the things you mentioned earlier was, pulling together a group of people with energy and passion, but at the same time trying to maintain some kind of focus, so that the group doesn't begin to address all the issues or all the range of concerns they might have, and really focuses on a singular. Could you share with us?
I didn't pull them together. People responded because they knew it was there and they were frightened. And I was a focal point for that, and the time was right for that all to happen. Keeping people focused was not easy, and I didn't have as much control over these organizations because they were too unwieldy as people might think. But one is able to say, we have a different agenda that we should have to attend to first, and the people responded to that. We were desperate for something to take, some kind of medicine to take, and if you could just keep people focused on that, and it wasn't that difficult, because everybody needed it, so that you could say, let's deal with that, and not whether people are being discriminated against in the hospitals, which was something for GMHC to fight.
Who are your allies and who are your opponents?
Today?
Let's answer it both. Let's look back and then let's ask for today.
Your allies, who's ever there with you, fighting with you, and who are your opponents? Everybody else. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of opponents.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, you have to realize that people don't like gay people, and they're never going to like gay people, and you can either face up to that and stand up to it and confront it, or you can lie down and be a victim, as most gay people do. We are not loved. We will never be loved. There will always be a church that hates us, a religion that hates us, and a family person and good friend that is uncomfortable with it. So best to face up to that and deal with it than to go in the closet or be ashamed of it or punish yourself for it.
How would you define a good citizen?
I'm not interested in being a good citizen. Citizen is a word that's too loaded with them, with the bureaucracy, whatever, being like everybody else. I define a good human being as somebody who takes responsibility for his life and making the world a better place.
Again, what's interesting is a lot of your work challenges the questions that I'm asking.
Yes.
So I'll read the original.
You're them.
I'll read the original question, and then I'd be curious how you'd modify it. So the question, as we typically ask, is what, in your view, constitutes constructive opposition? And I guess I would propose it sounds based on hearing from you that there may be no such thing as unconstructive opposition. So you might even challenge the premise of the question, but I'd be curious to hear you.
I'm already lost in the rhetoric of your question. I've lost. It has lost meaning to me. I don't understand what you're saying. You're trying very hard, which is fine, to parse me, and
parse you how?
Like I'm a sentence with a subject and a predicate and a verb, and people aren't so diagrammable. What I am today is not what I'm necessarily going to be tomorrow, and that's certainly true in the case of one of my best friends now in the world is Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. We truly love each other now. It is the most wonderful friendship. In 1983 or 4, I wrote a series of articles that appeared all across the country in which I called him a murderer. And that was how I was then, and this is how we are now. And he'll be the first one to talk about those days.
That's a remarkable journey for two people to go through. So
yes,
can you reflect on?
I think we're both proud of ourselves, that we both helped each other and learned from each other, and that we have this friendship now. Yes, it is a remarkable journey. It's exceedingly moving because of that. This life of his last, since 1981 has been filled with things that are exceedingly moving that bring tears to your eyes.
You mentioned earlier that the group was, as you can imagine, expressing itself in different ways, and that there was no central kind of thing. You also use the metaphor of an army, which is interesting because typically we think of as an army as very regimented, very organized, and very orderly. So I'd be curious to hear you reflect on the kind of the tension of trying to
I got a lot of
direction.
flack in ACT UP for using the word army. We are an army. They hated it. Not because it was regimented, because it connoted violence of a certain, or control of a certain way. And this was a group of people who certainly did not want to in any way think that they were being controlled. And one didn't have control of them. One only could use one's ability of whatever, persuasion, respect, whatever. There was a moment in time when there were some 30 or 40 chapters of ACT UP in the United States, where I realized that if I wanted to, I could make it into an army. And I thought a lot about it and decided against it. And I don't know that I could tell you why.
That's exactly what I'd most hope to know, the deliberations. So what would be the benefits of armatizing it, and what would be the drawbacks?
Well, I'm sure there's some of both. I just instinctively thought it was not the thing to do. And you ask why a lot, and I used to ask why a lot, and after a while you realize that there aren't any real answers to why, or there are a million answers to why, and one's just as good as another. Why are gay people so passive when their lives are at stake? Why? Why didn't everybody fight for their lives when they knew their lives were in danger, and still are? I don't know. Why did I do certain things? I don't know. A lot of it was instinct, hunch. Why am I a writer? How am I a writer? Why do I write well or badly? I don't know how to answer those. What makes a creative person? I don't know. The description I gave to you early on of my childhood is quite often the description that is offered for many writers in their lives. Is that what made me a writer? Perhaps. After a while, the whys don't make so much difference as the hows, and as the what are we going to do about it?
What? Yeah.
Mm.
Was there a question ever in your mind about, I'm going to use the word secession, But if you think about the momentum that these groups you're a part of had at different points, did you ever look to the future and say who or what will continue this momentum, or was it really about riding the crest of a wave without really looking what became before or after?
We had plans. There was a man called Paul Popham, who was the president of the board of the original Gay Men's Health Crisis. He and I, it was the two of us, our energy that really got GMH and kept it going, got it off the ground. And we used to think that we had the makings of a great movement for gay health. That when this had all passed, which of course it didn't, but we thought it would, that we would somehow metamorphose all of that into, you know, a Kaiser Permanente or something like that.
That's terrific.
And then after a while you realize that you can think of all these things, but there's never a way that you can put it into practice. My lover, David Webster, is always saying, why are you the only one still doing this? You know, where are the other people to come out there and scream and yell and do what I did? And they don't seem to be there. So yes, it would have been nice. I'd be happy to turn it over to somebody else and fade into the sunset, but I don't see anybody there doing it. There were more people originally than there are now.
And now I'm curious, because I could think about someone to hand it off in two ways. Why aren't there more people who were contemporaries with you at that time who have gone on and, you know, left these issues behind them? Or alternatively, why isn't there a next generation of folks who seem as energized or engaged?
Again, there you go with your whys again. I don't know.
Okay, so then, well, so then I'll surrender the whys and ask the how. So how if you know, if I were to set my sights on not having as many folks kind of, you know, fade into the background?
Well, most of my contemporaries died, so that took care of a lot of them. Certainly the people who were leaders. It's amazing that a lot of the people who showed up to take leadership and positions of responsibility in the early years somehow sensed that they were sick. They weren't. We didn't have tests, whatever. Maybe they were just worried that they were, and in most instances they were right. So if that was part of the fear that motivated them to come, I don't know. People left law firms. People left big jobs making a lot of money to come and work for GMHC, to come and devote themselves to ACT UP, because I think a lot of them sensed they were the next ones, and in most cases they were. So in terms of the younger generation, I think very ill of it or them. I really truly do. We fought all these fights for them, and it's as if everybody died in vain, and I consider it a shocking abdication of responsibility on the part of almost every gay man and lesbian that I know. Those are strong words, and I have a lot of gay and lesbian friends, and I think most of them would agree with me. And why it's that way, I don't know. I don't know. Things are okay. You got drugs. You can get married and adopt a kid. All of these are wonderful achievements, but they are also pacifiers.
Pacifiers from what? So
They
what's
keep
the
you
agenda?
from it pacifies your anger, you know. For most people, life is, I guess, okay. I guess. I don't know. I mean, my life is fine.
Could we turn a spotlight for a minute? And this group may or may not have existed, but I'm curious about them, which would be the folks who joined in these efforts, who didn't have that immediate kind of self-interest may be too strong a word, but you know, it may have been straight people who chose to work with you. It may have been women who weren't directly, you know, at risk of contracting. I'm curious what, if anything, you think compelled those individuals to be a part of this.
I think a lot of people were generally moved by what was happening.
Were they helpful to you? I guess I would ask. Were they
people
helpful
who joined
to you?
ACT UP like that, you mean, or people?
Yeah, people who may have joined ACT UP who weren't necessarily, didn't have that visceral kind of threat from the issues.
Well, I think that there was certainly compassion on their part, and that's certainly visceral. As I told you, we had a wonderful woman called Iris Long, who came, a biochemist, I think, who came along and taught us all our first lessons about the system and the science of it all. And she was just a married woman straight married woman from Queens who was upset that the world was allowing all this to happen, and she was a straight woman. There are plenty of mothers who came along who either had lost children or had friends or were just moved by the situation. You have to have a pretty hard heart not to be moved by it, and some people were moved enough to join and help. You can ask the whys and you can come up with good answers, but that doesn't necessarily bring more people into doing it. If I knew the secret of what makes people come and fight, I'd be a rich man, spiritually and every other way.
You know, it's interesting. The metaphor would be a military that's not by conscription, but by,
I don't know what I think. This country is so awful, and the government is so awful.
Awful how?
It just is. It's just hideous to people who are poor, and who are people of color, or who the have-nots. 50 million people don't have health insurance. Those kinds of statistics. Millions of people in poverty in the richest country in the world. And that's what I mean by awful. A president who lies constantly and gets away with it, is not held to task for it, who has nothing but support from a certain segment of the country which happens to hate people like me, who's able to raise millions and millions of dollars to be reelected, where we can't even get a candidate to be recognizable enough to want to support. These are all very unhealthy, unhappy signs. It's a country that is not a democracy. It's a country that is hypocritical and hateful in very, very many ways. It's fine if you got money, and very few people do.
And it's strange, because again, I don't want to go to the place of the why, but to stick with the how. How would you encourage, if you had the ear of folks who are in those disadvantaged positions?
Well, I said to the woman from South Africa who said, "What can we do?" And I said, "Get off your ass and fight. Stop looking to other people to help you. It's nice if America could bail out everybody, but we can't." And there are 60 million people infected across the third world. That's a lot of people to make a lot of noise, and you hear very little of it. Why the president of South Africa, Mbeki, hasn't been assassinated by now, I simply do not know. The man is an idiot and just evil.
Right.
Evil. And so much evil is allowed to exist.
Let me push on this for a moment, because one of the things that strikes me about that comparison is that the kinds of tactics you would use in the U.S. where, and I'll put this forth as a hypothesis, you can tell me if you agree or not, where it's really a distribution question, where the resources are there, and you just have to have them distributed or focus the attention on the disease, versus in Africa, where the infrastructure isn't there, where the government spending isn't there. So arguably, you're shining a spotlight on things when they have basic nutrition problems, basic education problems. So I guess I am curious how we think about those two challenges, and whether in both cases it still comes back to people, coming, finding their voice and starting to misbehave, or to behave as they should.
Again, I get lost in the rhetoric of your question.
So it comes back to the...
You want to...
Or take the question back to where it should be.
How much do you want to stay alive? How much is that worth to you? That always seemed to me to be the most important thing is that I desperately want to stay alive. And you have to fight to stay alive. People are not going to keep you alive. They can help you, but in the end, you're the one that's got to fight for them to help you.
I'm curious, when you say stay alive, are you talking specifically physically stay alive, or is there an emotional life? I guess I'm curious how far you would extend that to.
As far as you want. Whatever you need to have it, however far you need to extend it. I mean it just like that. I mean staying alive, not dying. No, I don't think of it in spiritual terms or philosophical terms. I mean it in practical terms. I want to live. And in 1981, I want to live, and presented with a problem that might kill me. And first of all, you have to identify what it is that you think is going to be this thing that's going to kill you, and how do you stop it from killing you. It's very pragmatic, everything that we did and that I attempted to keep us focused on. We wanted to live. So what does that require? It means identifying who doesn't want, who the people who don't want us to live, and the people who can help us live. And how do you get the drug companies to do what they're supposed to do, and how do you get the government to do what they're supposed to do? These are enormous problems, and it took a lot of self-education on the part of us in ACT-UP.
I'm fascinated by this notion of discipline and staying focused, and I guess I'm curious, any times when your attention, where it was hard to focus because you felt that, you know, this other sort of activity or this other thing was just so compelling, or was it really, I mean, if it's a life...
It was strictly pragmatic. I learned early on that I only had so many hours in the day, and I only had so much energy. And there were a lot of things that I cared about and that I could fight about, but you had to be very brutal in choosing your fights. And some of the fights were more important than other fights. And we had a lot of fights over which were the most important fights. God knows, you know. Women's health rights. When you're an organization of men and women, how do you know, we're fighting for women's health rights too. I'm sorry, women's health rights across the board, no. Women's health rights with HIV, yes, or with AIDS or whatever. So that's what I mean about being harsh. Yes, it would be wonderful if we had national health insurance or better insurance. Although we did make insurance, we did gain a lot of changes in the insurance law in New York State. But that's what I mean about being brutally. How do you get the government to research things that they don't want to research? How? I mean, people would look at you and their mouth would go like that. And when you think about it, your mouth does fall. How do you even begin to attack something like that? Who do you go after? Who is the person? Which is the agency? Where's the money from? Who's the congressperson? I mean, there's an enormous cast of characters involved in every question you ask. And these people change every minute because they're leaving town, or they're getting reelected or not reelected.
Did that maze ever prove demoralizing? Or
no, it was almost like a game after a while. You call somebody up and they're not there at the office, and oh, what happened to her? What happened to him? Ah, well, tell me about yourself. And then you have to start giving AIDS 101 to everybody. Every reporter who got assigned the AIDS beat knew nothing about AIDS when they started, and you really literally had to give them AIDS 101 every time. Still happens. You realize within 3 seconds of talking to a reporter how much he or she doesn't know. So you have to tell them all, and then you have to, you know, the media, that's another thing that is very important that I didn't talk about. The media can be your friend, and I made it my friend. I made it my job to know all the reporters I possibly could, whether they were writing about us or not.
Larry, I'm about to ask the how question.
Well, I like
to make the media friend, to make the media your friend, how?
No, I don't mean media.
No, I know, but I'm curious. So keep with that line about how to work the media in that way.
Well, there's a woman you should call Sarah Just, who's the producer of Nightline on ABC, and it took forever for Koppel or any of those or that program to do anything about AIDS, and I just kept calling her all the time, and she kept taking the call even though I kept yelling at her and sending her very strong emails, and she'll talk about it. She says, "Larry taught me everything I know about AIDS," she's important, so it's worth the effort to do all of that. And then they did do some very good programs. And when they do a bad program, you tell them it's a bad program. And they begin to be nervous about your opinion, and which is good, which is what you want. So that's the kind of work you have to do.
How were you envisioning using the press? So was it general consciousness raising? Was it shame? Was it what?
We had no bridge to the outside world. We had a president, Reagan, who did not say the word AIDS in public for the first 7 years of his reign. Now that's unthinkable. 7 years, and then when he did say it, it was very unnice what he said, and we were there to boo him, which he didn't like at all. We had that, and so how do you get a message out except through the media? And how do you have closeted gay reporters who don't want to come near you. You have people homophobic who don't want to come near you. But slowly you begin to recognize the people who will listen, especially if there's a good story involved. And there were plenty of good stories, about heartwarming, human interest stories. And little by little, and you can never stop, because there'll be a whole raft of stories for 3 months, and then they don't want to write about you again. So you got to whip it all up again. That's what I mean, that activism is never ending. You can never stop. But it is possible to identify a few friends, perhaps not so many in the bureaucracy, but among the people who could write about the bureaucracy. Mind you, there were people in power, certain senators and people in Congress who were on our side. Waxman, for instance.
Larry, let me ask. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it? I'm struck that for a while you were an activist, really in a hotbed of activity, where you had a lot of activists, in arms with you. And today, as you mentioned, it's a battle to get the articles. It's a battle to get the coverage, and a lot of folks have fallen away. So I guess I'd be curious. Any reflections on being an activist when you've got, a whole community around you similarly engaged, and trying to be an activist when you're really.
You mean, is it lonely now?
If lonely is the experience, then lonely. Or maybe you enjoy. I don't know. I guess I'm curious.
I don't think that. I'm 68 years old, and I've just had a liver transplant, and you don't have the sustained energy that I used to have. I don't miss going to ACT UP meetings, even if they were there. I don't miss having the same fights. The things that I cared most passionately about a lot of them have been achieved. There are, I don't know, 18 drugs out there now that will keep people with HIV alive. That was my original goal: find medicine that would keep us alive. There isn't a cure, but there's something that can give you that. In many people will give them a normal life. So the pressure isn't so much on, and the battle in other areas is I pass on to others. As I say, I'm disappointed that other people haven't come along with any great visibility to do what I did.
Sure. Let me ask you about one person who has come along, who my students actually went back and forth quite a bit about, but I'm interested in Zaki Ahmad in a South African context, and in particular I'd like you to speak to, he took a personal pledge not to take his drugs because he could afford them.
We had a Bobby Thompson, or whatever his name was, a nurse, a man in San Francisco in the early 80s, did the same thing.
So I guess what I'm curious about is, again, not part of a larger strategy, just, again, thinking about human nature, thinking about the role one can play as an activist. What do you think of that kind of...
I think
Or what's your reaction? Is shy of analyzing it? Is that something Larry Kramer would do? Is that something?
No.
Why?
I would not take medicine. Because I want to stay alive, and he's more use alive than dead. And to endanger his health that way is to endanger his usefulness. there are equally dramatic things that can be done, like throwing himself on Mbeki, or whatever. There are physical things that he could have done that can be done by activists that are not so dramatically endangering to his own health. People think that I got a lot of my medicines or that I got my liver because of who I am, which certainly was not the case. But believe me, if I had to use who I was to get what I needed to stay alive, I would have done it. I think it's important to have a sense of self-preservation in all of this, and not victimization. His symbolic act didn't achieve anything. There's not to say that it wasn't a brave and valiant act, and I wish that more people in Africa were as dramatically angry in one way or another to contribute to pushing the button.
All right, this are going to ask you a little bit about the context. And again, we're interested in some of the things that may be going on in the environment when certain advocates come to the forefront. What is it about the situation in which you found yourself that you most wanted to change? And this, I'm imagining, will be an easy one for you.
Everything. And it's pretty much still the same way. I do not like being discriminated against in it. And I guess I want to have just as much as they have, they being the heterosexual majority. And I don't like not having it. And I don't like not having it because they don't like me.
What were the major contextual constraints? So what was going on in the environment?
What is contextual? That's such an academic word. What does contextual mean?
Things that were happening. So if you imagine, or if you were trying to get what the other group has, right? What was going on at the time that you began to, or if your goal was...
At the time. Since time began, people have hated gay people, and it's still the same way. So nothing could be more contextual than that.
Well, let me push back on you, because from what I understand, your goal was not to get people to like gay people, but your goal was to get access to certain institutions.
Well, it all amounts to the same thing. I'm not getting these services because they don't like me. It's cogito ergo sum, or whatever the expression is, ergo.
You're going to, okay, sure. Make some of the linkages, because right now I could imagine we could have certain HIV drugs developed without a heterosexual majority being particularly well-intentioned towards gays. And so I guess
well,
we're curious.
But I mean, that's certainly the case. It's happened because
right.
It's turned out that pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money off of the medicine. So
right.
it doesn't, that takes care of itself. But no one thought there was any money in it originally,
right.
Believe it or not.
So is your advocacy focused, or you can push back and say that they're too intertwined to disentangle, but is your advocacy focused on gaining access to certain resources and institutions, or is it focused on sort of liking and saying, why doesn't this other group like us? And how are we going to eliminate those attitudes?
Like us. I don't care if they like us, and I think we spend too much time worrying, both as a population, as this individual, that people like us. It's a waste of time. They're going to like you if they want to like you, and they're not going to like you if they don't like you. You have to find the things that you need that you're not being provided with, and get them. You're entitled to them. Everybody in this country is entitled to good health care. 50 million people don't have any health insurance. Why are they so passive? Why aren't they setting fire to the buses? I told you that story, my favorite story.
Actually, would you share that again? Because it's a great...
Well, we ACT UP had a demonstration outside of City Hall somewhere in the mid-'80s. No, late 80s. We had about 300 people, and it was a fairly peaceful demonstration. And there was a woman reporter from Brazil who came over to me and said, "You call this a demonstration?" She said, "In my country, when they raise the bus fare, they burn the buses. Well, why aren't we burning the buses? Why are people so passive when they don't? Why were women so quiet about breast cancer for so many years and still continuing, you know? Breast cancer has been around forever, and it's only the last few years that they've come up with something. Where's the pressure from this entire female community in the world?
Arguably the majority, the world majority.
Yeah, figure that one out. I don't know why. Because it doesn't happen, because by the time you get it, it's too late to be an activist. But so what? I mean, you know what's down the pike.
Well, it's interesting. One of the arguments for why you don't see a more effective advocacy for children is that people are parents only for a relatively short while, and then the children grow up. So it's not as strong as these other groups that people belong to for their entire life. All right, this last set of questions is a challenging one for us because they really move you in the direction that they're moving against stream. They really are trying to understand an environmental cause instead of looking to individuals. And they're asking the why not, you know, they're asking them, well, what's happening outside individuals? And one theme that I'm taking away from our conversation is the value or import of looking at the potential within any person to stop or interrupt that, you know, and to begin.
I just think everybody's got such power inside of him or herself to move mountains, and it's not so difficult to reach if you have the desire to reach it. A lot of wasted energy and manpower in the world. A lot of wasted brain power. It's very sad. It's tragic.
All right. We've made it to the end of the official interview guide. What I'd like to do
these are the questions you ask everybody. Right?
Well, the value add of asking is we'd like to see some trends or see how people grapple with them differently.
What are the trends you see?
I can't speak to that now.
You haven't interviewed enough people?
No. I'm also swayed by the interview that I'm doing now. I'd like to give you the final word, and I just want to throw out two things that kind of jumped out from the conversation and the earlier conversation you had at the center. One is this notion of anger, and its importance and its role and its healthiness and any number of things that I think you sort of really bring to the forefront. The other is something around personal experience, personal affronts, personal relationships, and an experience of advocacy that really seems born not in an abstract, why is the world this way, but really as a first-person kind of, I'm experiencing this. And so I'd be curious for any final reflections you have that you might want to share with future students, current students, but in general, perhaps these two themes are themes that are important to you. It's a loaded last question.
It's too cosmic for me. Again, from the beginning to the end, I lost the focus of what you were asking me.
So the general focus is simply any final reflections you have or things, and I was just sharing two things that sort of emerged for me. One is the personal experience and how that really played a role.
Well, I think, yes, it did, but I think everybody has personal experiences that are painful, that they either abide or push aside or ignore or deny. Every mother's got a kid in school who's had some kind of experience of a bad education. That should be enough to make any parent angry enough to protest, and doesn't. Every woman has a dozen friends who've had breast cancer. We all have these personal experiences. It's just a question of recognizing them and wanting to do something about it. And why everything is allowed to stay the way it is because people deny these problems and are overcome by them and are not unwilling to confront them or are overwhelmed with how you attack them. And indeed, it does take a lot of work to, as I hope I've made clear, to identify what you can do about them. But one should look upon that as a challenge, like reading a good mystery story and trying to figure out who done it, rather than something that becomes so crippling and allowing the status quo to remain that way. I'm amazed at how passive people are, even, or especially smart people. It doesn't take but one person to hold a placard up in public when somebody is presenting publicly a point of view of the government, say, and you wanna show your anger. One person holding one placard can get a picture in the paper, can embarrass a public official if it gets in the paper, and they're terrified of being embarrassed. That's one thing I learned. And I've been that one person a lot of times, and yeah, you sort of get a little stage fright when you're up there doing it. And yes, you know people who think you're an asshole, but when the speaker starts fumbling and getting embarrassed, and you know that you scored, and it reverberates down the line somehow. And if enough people do it, it certainly reverberates down the line. And ACT UP was successful because enough people did it. Enough of us held up those placards. Just placards being one of many things that you can do. If enough people write letters to enough Congress people, they hear it. I'm not such a big fan of the letter writing thing because all that tends to get lost in the shuffle. I'm much more keen on visibility stuff. And it's not such a terrible thing to be arrested, which I have been many times, which we all were many times. They can't do anything to you. We're so terrified, oh my God, I'm arrested. They take you and they put you in a cell and you hang out for a while and they let you go. So you've lost a half a day. But when enough people get arrested, they don't like that because it ties up the system and whatever. You want to embarrass them, you know. The demonstrations and things that changed history, all those anti-Vietnam protests, changed history. I'm amazed that there are not so many of them. I'm amazed that so many people put up with so much shit without doing anything about it.
Larry, I think you give us a wonderful paradox, which is the question of why, not more, and then you also give us a vivid example of when and how someone did. So, thank you. It's been absolutely a pleasure to talk with you.
Good luck. I don't think I've ever done anything special. I don't think I've done any. People come up to me and say thank you for what you're doing, and my first reaction always is, huh? My reaction is, why aren't you doing it too? It's no big deal. And
which I love. I mean, and you did that today. I think that kind of holding up a mirror for other people instead of saying, don't emulate me, just ask, look inside and see. But why, I mean, that comes back to the question of human nature. Is this...
I'm still running.
Yeah.
Do you want me to shut it off?
No, keep it going. But that's too easy to say it's human nature. That's a cop-out. There are 80 zillion people in the world. Everybody's got a different human nature. So different people.
Right. So what is it? So why is it? Or let's stay with the how, because I know the why is. So the how is it that you get large numbers of people to move beyond the complacency of everyday life, the perceived comfort or the perceived security, in order not to act on behalf of anyone else's interests other than their own? I mean, leave apart whether we could get groups acting for others' interests, but simply their own self-interest.
Well, how? You speak up and say what's on your heart every day to everybody you can, which is what I do. When you see something awful going on, you try and identify it to your friends publicly. Isn't this awful? And don't be silent. Silence equals death, which is the famous ACT UP motto. And that's true. You find ways to make noise. It's simply not so difficult. I was amazed at that professor today who was complaining about he can't get Harvard to give a gay student center here, and I said, have you got tenure? Was the first question I asked him, and he said yes. I said, then what do you care? They can't do anything to you. Go pick at the president's house. And such a thought never ever occurred to him. What's such a big deal about standing outside of whatever his name is house and saying Abraham Lincoln was gay, or we want to be able to study that, or we want gay studies here, or whatever, you know? Especially effective because it's not coming from a kid, it's coming from a middle-aged man who's on the faculty. Even better. And that never occurred to him. That's the conformist army in which everybody marches, everywhere. And I guess I learned how to glory in that difference somewhere along the line. I couldn't march in that army for various reasons. I was gay primarily. And so you learn how to glory with your difference. And just that, glory in it. I love being a homosexual man.
I was picking up on the word you're using, glory, because it's a rich one.
I love being gay. I wouldn't want to be straight for all the tea in China. And it hasn't always been that way. And it's been a long journey from there to here, but it's been a wonderful journey. And all of these experiences that I've talked about with you today, dramatic as they were, it's been an incredible journey. I feel fortunate to have been able to have lived the life I've lived and to have been able to be useful to the world. That gives me a lot of pleasure, that I've been well used for whatever reason. And that journey is available to anybody. That was no big deal. A little more stubborn, perhaps, than others, but God knows everybody's got that in whatever.
Thank you very much.
Okay, get me to the airport on time. Made me angry. At the same time, there was a letter to the editor published in the New York Native, our newspaper in New York, gay newspaper, written by a playwright, now dead from AIDS, by the name of Robert Chesley, which made me very angry as well, because he was responding to my earlier plea, not the 1,112 and counting article, but I had written something earlier than that. And he just made fun of me and said that there goes Larry Kramer again. He had hated Faggots, my novel, and in which he maintains Faggots is about that the wages of gay sex is death, which it certainly isn't, nor is it the theme of the novel. And what made me mad about Chesley's attack was that we had been together, we had been to bed together, and he had come to interview me for a publication, and he professed to thinking that Faggots was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And we went to bed together, which the minute I did it, I knew was a mistake. And he wanted to do it again, carry on with from there, and I didn't. And so he turned on me and wrote very nasty pieces about me in the gay press, and then attacked me over my call to arms. And I just thought that made me very angry, because that's not what it was about. You know, he was attacking me on a personal vendetta level, and the hypocrisy of that made me angry. And I was going to a very good shrink at the time, Norman Levy, his name was, and he saw how angry I was, and he says, well, why don't you do something about it? And it went from there. I don't know how. He said, why don't you just, I don't know, what are you? You're a writer, write about it. So then I sat down and wrote 1,112 and counting.
I'd be interested to have you speak a little bit about what you think someone can achieve through their writing in terms of influencing others and mobilizing them for change versus what he or she can do through their actions. Because one of the interesting things...
I don't know how to answer those questions. They're too global, or they're too... You have to have certain skills, and you have to have, the timing has to be right, and GMHC came along and people responded to it because the time was right, and ACT UP came along and at a moment in time when there was all that energy ready to be coalesced, and a lot of it is timing. I don't think you could start an ACT UP today or a gay organization today that would get those kinds of responses as we got, and those able to say what you want to say seems to be worth any price. It wasn't always that way. I was a frightened child, and I certainly was timid.
Interesting. Are there any personal limitations that you think may have hampered?
Limitations?
So if we talked a little, or think a little bit about the aptitudes that you had, things that you might say, gee, without this I would have been more effective, or...
Oh. Well, I went through a period where I thought that all the leaders of who were fighting AIDS, everybody had a tragic flaw of one sort or another. The people who were the smartest, Mathilde Krim, Joe Sonnabend, myself, really had a sense of what it was all about, had certain character traits that rendered us impossible of being as effective as we could be. Perhaps my temper, my hot-headedness, certainly Joe's inability to communicate with other people, and Mathilde's sort of, I don't know what her tragic flaw is, but because she's a great lady, but why couldn't she take it further or whatever? She wasn't good at choosing people to run her organization. She had a bad sense of management choices, so that AmFAR never became quite the organization it should have been, because she put inept people in charge of it constantly. So, but after a while you realize you and AmFAR is still there, and Matilda's still fighting, so you realize that you work with what you got, and I didn't know how to do it any other way. I mean, you couldn't say Larry, shut up, because if Larry shut up, then Larry would be rendered immobile. I was very happy to discover, and I didn't know this, that I could write political rhetoric. That was all news to me. I'd never tried before. I'd written faggots, and I'd written a couple of plays that were very unsuccessful, and I had written the screenplay for Women in Love. So I knew that I could write, but these were all different kinds. This was more imaginative writing. Now I was writing nuts and bolts. Angry rhetoric. I didn't know. I was just trying to make people sit up and pay attention, and I used strong language, and
you with us at the Center for Public Leadership, and what I'd like to do is walk through a series of questions that we ask as part of our Lessons of Leadership archive project. The first set of questions have to do quite a bit about your experience as an individual. So to start, I'd be curious to know what happened or did not happen in your early life that might help explain your call to action and your call to leadership.
We're getting very Freudian here. I guess you just look back and say, okay, maybe these things had something to do with how you turned out. I've had enough therapy over the years, God knows. Mostly Freudian, although not all. A lot of things you don't know where they come from, and I don't know what made me angry. I don't know what made me be able to fight back plenty of people have unhappy childhoods, and plenty of people have parents that they're not fond of, both of which are true in my case. But often in those cases, the children or the offspring are damaged in sort of different and potent ways. I don't know what made me stand up to my father, who was very abusive to me, but I did. And I had a mother who defended me, but whose defense I didn't believe. So I felt very much a loner and alone. I suspect that my brother, who shared similar feelings toward my parents, our parents, was my major role model, and certainly he has been exceedingly my parent in life. He's the one that sort of almost brought me up and saw that I got the good education and did the right things. Got me into therapy. So I don't know if this contributes to the ability to respond to what I perceived as a danger when I did, but to this day I don't know really where all of that comes from. I had a mother who was a social worker. She ran the local chapter of the American Red Cross in a small Maryland town near where we lived. And so whether her notion of service and taking care of people and all that rubbed off on me, I don't know. I rather tend to think not days. In terms of can writing change the world? Well, obviously I think so, because that's why I'm a writer. I'm fortunate that I have certain skills, or I've discovered that I had certain skills to be able to write. Whether people will listen or not, I don't know. I'm always amazed when anybody knows who I am, and that's true.
I'd like to push on this a little bit, because it's one of the discussions within leadership is, do great moments make great leaders, or do great leaders create great moments? And I guess if you were thinking about things in the environment that would let something like an ACT UP or a GMHC take hold and take off, what sorts of things do you think that sort of are going on in the environment that makes it ripe for those kinds of things?
My mind doesn't work that way. Do great leaders make great causes or whatever? I don't know. What makes a movie star? What is it about a person's persona that makes somebody captured on film memorable, and someone just walk across the screen and you've forgotten her or him? I don't think anybody can define those things. I certainly don't think I've got charisma or whatever. I think now people respect me, but they didn't throughout all of those years. I had a small group of people who were loyal and faithful, and we managed to accomplish certain things, and it's gone on from there.
What skills or traits do you think that you brought to bear that small group may have responded to, or?
I've always said exactly what I felt. I don't care if it makes people angry, if that's how I feel. I've always been very honest and truthful, and I've not been afraid to confront people of power. And I've never been afraid of anyone. And I think as we were a community that was in New York that was frightened, that impressed people. They needed that. Or some people needed it. There were plenty of gay people who hated me and who would cross the street not to be on the same side. And that's true. I was no longer welcomed at Fire Island after Faggots came out. I'm serious. I was actually asked to leave. And I'm sure there are people to this day who from those generations who disapprove of me. But that has never bothered me, and I don't know where that came from. I've been able to ride, and that, I think, just comes from a lot of therapy. Because we used to make fun of it, so, you know, she was out there taking care of everybody but us. But so be it.
And if those were some of the early life experiences, what about things more proximal to when you first started to get engaged, when you first started to get active? What were some of the immediate things going on then that may have led you to?
I mean, I had a bunch of friends who got sick, and I had a bunch of friends who died, and I knew them all, and a doctor whom Alvin Friedman Keene of NYU, who made the first announcement in the New York Times of what was going on, a man whom I respected, said, "I think it's fed by Saxon. I think that something's going on here, and if it were happening." He said, I think people should realize that something is going on and modify their behavior accordingly. And I said that because it made a lot of sense to me. As I said it earlier today, I don't think that it took any great perception. I'm always being given credit of being some kind of seer. I don't understand why other people didn't see it too. As I said, anybody who spent a night, all night long in the meat rack at Fire Island Pines should have enough brains to realize that something like this is certainly possibly happening. And God knows I'd spent enough nights myself in the meat rack of Fire Island Pines. So, looking back on it, I don't know. I was made angry by the fact that nobody was willing to pay any attention to it, and instead of turning my back, it just made me angry, and I'm glad that it did. We needed help, and no one was there to give it to me or to us. And I had gone to Yale, and I had been very successful in the world, and I was not used to being shunned. I had been assistant to the president of Columbia and then United Artists. I had supervised hundreds of employees. I had huge budgets that I oversaw. I was used to people listening to me. And when we were trying to get our first office space from the city for a little minuscule operation, because no one would rent to us, even though we had the money, so we wanted something from the city, tried to get a hold of the mayor, and I was pretty much I was made to feel demeaned, and I didn't like the feeling. And that